So guys, back here at MKS Performance. Today's a big day. We've got all the parts back for our Supercharged 2.9 VR6. So I'll just give you a little talk through of what we're going to be doing today. Obviously we've got a new oil pump here. It's always a good insurance policy whenever you're forging an engine. It means a substantial investment into the engine. You want to have a new oil pump. That is your heart, your beating heart for any engine. And we've got the various different other bits and pieces for the engine. It's all been cleaned, it's been inspected, checked for damage and whatnot. It might look clean to the eye, but you need to degrease things. A little jerry can of petrol into a beaker, and this is what happens afterwards. You can see all the sludge that's at the bottom of there. There's even swarf in there. So it might look clean to the human eye, but until you've degreased it and then blasted it with an airline, it's never really clean. So we'll start with the various different bits and pieces. If you're not familiar with the VR6 crankshaft here, we'll be measuring the oil clearances. We've got plastic gauge and various different mics we'll be using for that, and a couple of calculations. We've got a second-hand impulse ring because unfortunately the original one got damaged on the way back from the engine balancers. So that's going to get fitted today as well. We've got the drive gear. Basically, you've got chain drive for the camshafts on this particular engine. So we'll have the main drive coming off the crankshaft onto the idler gear, and then this section will then drive the camshafts via two chains. But it also drives the oil pump because you have the shaft input here. That then goes in the side of the block here. You've then got heli gear in here, which makes up to another one in here, which then drives the shaft, the input shaft for the oil pump. So it's a very unusual design, but it's quite effective. Via that. Okay, so moving on. The previous builder had already used ARP head studs. You can obviously reuse these. I've obviously cleaned them, then inspected them. There's no damage to report, which is good. If you do find damage on the threads, if it's the block end or if it's the actual physical nut end that you're going to be torquing, if they are got a damaged thread, throw them in the bin. Do not try and run a die down them to repair them because it will compromise the thread. APR recommend you buy a new one, and so do we, quite frankly. So we've got the con rods here. Obviously there's 6 of them. There's only 5 here. There's a reason for that. We have the 6th one over here. It's a little jig that we made up to crack the bolts, and it just keeps everything off surfaces, and it gives us a good grounds to measuring our actual rod stretch bolts. Now, when you're stretching bolts, most guys, or some in particular, will use a torque wrench to set the rod bolt to spec. Unfortunately, that's not good enough. You need to set these via stretch, not torque. You'll start off with torque, and then you start looking at how much stretch you have. But first, you need to measure the static length of the con rod bolt. So there, wobble it, we can see that there's no fluctuations in the dial indicator, so we'll then zero that, come off that, go back on just to double check. So a little bit there, and then you'll add your increased torque to that until you've then got around about 5.5 thou, 6 thou max stretch on these. These are the ARP 625 Plus. So ARP have come away with a new design, going away from ARP 2000. These are the new 625 Pluses. So there's that element. We've got our bore gauge, which we'll use for checking oil clearances for the crankshafts, as well as the big ends in the rods. We have our bearing shells here for the big ends for the con rods. We have 2 different sizes of bearings here. You have one for the actual con rod, and you have another one for the cap of the con rod. Then moving on, we have the top ring. Sorry, that's your top ring. This is your hang on a second. That's your top ring. That's your oil scraper ring. These are your oil control rings. Then obviously you've got your locks, which keep the wrist pins in place for your pistons. Now again, always check for damage, clean everything. Then moving on, don't forget the oil squirters for the VRs are in the saddles or the journals for the crankshaft bearings. Make sure you fit these before you fit the bearings for the mains. There's a budget we're sticking to on this build, so the main shells will be getting reused again. There's nothing wrong with them, they're perfectly fine, they're perfectly serviceable. But again, always make sure you fit your oil squirts before fitting the saddles. We have the head bolts, in fact, big pun, we have the main bolts, and we have the old ones. We're going to use the old ones to squash our plastic gauge because these are stretch cycle bolts. So we will use the old ones, we'll torque them, I think it's like 50 Newton meters or something like that, and then we'll throw them in the bin. And once we're happy with the actual oil clearances, we'll then fit and stretch the new ones. And that is about it, guys. What we will do, what I'd like to do, is finish each portion of an engine. So we'll do the oil clearances for the crankshaft, we'll do a little tutorial, a little video for you guys on how you check that, a little bit more in depth, and then we will move on to the big ends, and then the pistons, ring gapping, various different processes that we use to build and blueprint an engine for our customer. So stay tuned, guys. Thanks very much.